sessions. We have with us Dr. Rebecca Patrick, just give us a wave, Rebecca, and also Sandy Gonzalez de la Vega, also give us a wave, Sandy, both of our speakers here today. Rebecca's talk will feature key findings from her research group's work on mental health, climate change and nature contact, including eco-anxiety, active coping and the health benefits of environmental action. She will translate this science into practical and meaningful guidance for individual and community mental health promotion, hope, coping and connection. Sandy's voice will honour a young person's perspective of how climate change grief impacts personal and professional decisions for emerging leaders. She will discuss her paper on climate grief by looking at how it is experienced, particularly by young people and climate activists. Sandy will also share what helps people's mental health in a climate impacted world through her research findings and indeed her own experience. But before I formally introduce our speakers, I'll ask that as per webinar protocols that you leave yourselves on mute. And if you have any comments or questions as we go through the session today, chat is open and available for you. So put them in there and we'll come back to those for our later Q&A section. The session is being recorded and we anticipate that it will be used publicly. As we're discussing some sensitive topics today, we will be providing information about services that provide support should you need to contact them, and that'll become apparent. That those services will be placed in chat as we move through. So now to formally introduce one of the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre members. Proudly we like to own Dr. Rebecca Patrick. She is co-lead of Deakin Uni's Health, Nature, Sustainability Research Group and Vice President of the Climate and Health Alliance. She is a Senior Lecturer in Health Promotion and Course Director, Masters of Health and Human Services Management. Rebecca is involved in multiple planetary health-related projects at different scales, including the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre, Otway's Fire and Rain Summit, and a National Climate Health Research Network. Hobsons Bay is her home, and she is a surf lifesaver, and in her spare time, she spends a lot of that in the bay or in the National Park at Fairhaven. So I welcome our esteemed leader to discuss the topic she has for us today.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much. Just while I feel around, just want to say hello to everyone online. Thanks for joining us. Mother Nature is turned on a beautiful day, and I feel really appreciative that you are spending a little bit of time listening to this talk. So let me just pop my slides up. Move your head out the way, Sandra. Okay. Sandra, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can just see the slide and no other words? Fabulous. Okay. So welcome to the session on mental health and connection to nature, and what a wonderful part of the year to have this conversation with nature being on show either out the window or for those people with their earphones in listening to this conversation. I am Rebecca Patrick, and I'm the co-lead of the Health, Nature, Sustainability Research Group. So, like Sandra did at the start of the session, I too would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the various lands in which we're meeting today and discussing this really important topic, and pay my respects to elders and emerging leaders of that community. In the background of my screen today is a place called Fairhaven, but otherwise known as the place of the Eastern Maar people. And this is always a nice place to start, because nature and land is of great significance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. and connection to country is central to well-being, and also it's understood to be a cultural determinant of health. So what's in store? I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes and then I'm going to hand to Sandy to hear her testimony around nature and mental health connection. And then we're going to land towards the end on a handful of tips in terms of promoting your own health and well-being, mental health in particular, and also some links and bits and pieces that you can go away with. So I'll introduce my research group quickly. I'll give you an overview of the nature basics as the starting point for this conversation. And then I'd really like to talk to you about some research we've done on, with young people and also environmental workers as a mechanism for showcasing this link between nature and mental health. I'll give you a little bit of insight to some of the evidence around mental health benefits of nature and, like I said, some take-home activities. But before we do move into the agenda and the conversations for the day, I'd like to touch base with and share information about supports for mental health. Whilst the webinar is definitely focused on, as advertised, the mental health promotion aspects of contact with nature, to be able to get to looking at the mental health promotion, we also do need to touch on the other side of the story. So we will be talking about things like ecological grief, climate grief, and those sorts of concepts. It's also really important to acknowledge the sort of year that we've had between the mega fires, drought, floods, COVID-19 pandemic. Mental health issues have gone from simmer to boil in Australia, and also in Victoria to some extent. So these freely available and accessible phone and online services may be of benefit to you and people in your networks and your loved ones. So Penny, if you'll kindly post the links in the chat now, that'd be fantastic. So like Sandra pointed out, and as per the jacket that I've got on today, I work for Deakin University, and as you can see in my slide deck, and I work in the Faculty of Health, and I lead a wonderful research group, bias of course, called the Health Nature Sustainability Research Group. And those beautiful people that you can see on my screen are some of the staff members and also some of the students that we're working with at the moment. And a wonderful woman called Associate Professor Marty Townsend launched our research group over 10, if not 15 years ago. And I call her the godmother of this field of study, which is mental health and nature. Our goal within our research group is twofold. It's about generating research and also teaching people about the link between human health and the health of the natural environment. I'm an academic, so I like a bit of jargon. What that actually means for us is ecological determinants of health. That'll be an idea that you might see more of in the future. Like I said, there's my staff team, and I have the benefit of working with partner organisations. I think I see some, one or two online today. My own slides are hurrying me up here. There's a few people online today from our external partners and my students and other internal people from Deakin. While we're here talking about my research group, just a very quick snapshot of the research that we do. I would need multiple slides to walk you through all of the projects that students at honours, masters and PhD level have done with us. But here's just a snapshot, and hopefully it's big enough on your screen, or if you're out walking like my husband Paul, you might be able to look at your phone now and see the slide deck. Perhaps most importantly for us is that our research is co-designed or led by students and young people. And for me, they're the emerging leaders. These tiles are just a snapshot of the projects, and each of our projects is another branch in this area of science, social/health science. Okay, so now I'll narrow my focus to walk us through the link between mental health and nature, as per the advertisement for the session, Hope, Coping and Wellness. Here on the slide are some of the key concepts or givens that our research group or scientists in this space, they start from. These are our starting points. So the first idea is that idea of planetary health. Planetary health is the understanding that health of humans is inextricably linked to the health of the planet. We need a healthy planet for our fresh air to breathe, water and food and survival, and a relatively stable climate, which is neither too hot or cold. Secondly, on the slide, we see something called the biophilia hypothesis. This is a really, really important one. It's an idea I think we all instinctively understand, but let me just talk you through it. The biophilia hypothesis acknowledges we are dependent, double underline, on nature both physically, again for food, energy, water, but absolutely psychologically. We require it, or it is essential that we have contact with nature for our psychological well-being. It's in our reptilian brains. They are nature connections that we will subconsciously seek with the rest of, throughout the rest of our life. Another way of thinking about it, and the way I often talk about it, is it's being hardwired to green environments rather than being hardwired to concrete environments. Public health, which I work in, and we've heard a lot about in the COVID-19 pandemic. Public health has really come to the fore as a really important and crucial aspect of influencing positive livelihoods in Australia. Public health, my field, recognises that climate change, environmental degradation and environmental deprivation is a determinant of mental health and wellbeing. So notwithstanding the great COVID-19 disruption, today we are finding fewer opportunities to be in contact with nature incidentally. So that is in our day-to-day life. So that's rapid urbanisation, population expansion and technological advancements. And dare I say, I've got one of my kids next door on TikTok, means people have been estranged from their natural environments. More and more we're experiencing the effects of environmental deprivation. And environmental deprivation is thought to be a factor in declining mental and physical health, as well as cognitive development in children. However, the good news is, and let's keep coming back to the good news, environmental deprivation has been shown in many studies, including our studies that we do in our research group, to be alleviated by viewing nature, such as what you're doing at the moment in the screen or looking out the window, being in nature, such as my husband Paul is wandering around down at the dog park, contact with plants, so even indoor plants, and also contact with animals is health promoting. Also, another idea that I'd like to share with you towards the end of the slide is that taking environmental action or action on climate change is thought to have co-benefits for mental health. Now, I don't want to get too jargony, so benefits for mental health. When you go out and do something sustainable, there's a mental health buzz that goes with it. There's also social connection and can relieve ecological grief. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about ecological grief in a minute, and Sandy's going to tell you even more about that. But as we can see on the right-hand side, which is a Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre concept plan, I know there's been some updates, but this gives you a nice snapshot of what the intentions are of that proposed centre. This is a co-benefit concept. And what Hobsons Bay is doing is actually really quite unique. They are prioritising in an environmental context health and well-being of humans. So they're making that connection very explicit to that plan. And I'm particularly enthusiastic about that being a health promoter. So as you can see from the slide, it may be a bit tiny, but we can share more information about the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre, is that there's multiple benefits for human health, health of the environment, and also science of having something like the asset that which will be Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre. So on that, and because we're here on the invitation of Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre, which is a partner of my research group, I'll start with the positive news about being involved in a centre like Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre. Sandy, is my sound and everything okay? Thumbs up. Excellent. So where is that evidence that being involved in an organisation like Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre is good for your mental health? One of the opportunities of the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre in the future, and also it's also started to now, already a little bit now, despite the fact that we don't actually have a physical building, is that there'll be opportunities for environmental volunteering or conservation activities, particularly through citizen science. And we'll talk about that towards the end as well. And my research group has done a large statewide study in New South Wales, which is a similar state geographically and demographically to us, so we can transfer the evidence. And we studied environmental volunteers in their organisations, and we found that for mental and emotional health, these following things on the slide. That when you get your hands dirty and get involved in a local community environmental action, you improve your sense of satisfaction and achievement. It makes you feel good inside. It improves your self-esteem. You get a buzz or a relief from watching an area transform. You're a part of that change. Some people testify to having a sense of empowerment. And then there's others that have existing mental health illnesses, such as depression, maybe bipolar, also have improved mental health outcomes as a result of participating in environmental activities. So a thumbs up for those of you who are thinking about doing environmental volunteering for Hobsons Bay Wetland in the future. Okay. However, there's some good news. Let's tic-tac-toe to some of the other side of the story before I bring you back to the hope, coping and wellness part of the equation. Now I want to talk to you a bit deeper about the issues that goes to that biophilia hypothesis that I stated earlier on. To understand the problem of nature disconnection and worry and fear and concern, to be able to get to how we can get over it, for want of a better framing. The link between mental health and the natural world has come to the fore in 2020. And as I said at the start, and I nicked someone's idea, so I better ring the bell on who it was. Georgie Harman, the CEO of Beyond Blue, says that the challenge of 2020, including bushfires, COVID-19, have taken mental health issues from simmer to boil in our communities. Devastating bushfires demonstrating climate change is real, urgent and now, and puts at risk our natural environment and human health. And also that superstructure that we spend a lot of time thinking about, the economy. Who can forget 11-year-old Finn steering a powerboat away from the small town of Mallacoota with visibility severely reduced thanks to thick bushfire smoke and that apocalyptic background. Then we have COVID-19, which is an infectious zoonotic disease that can be traced back to human pressures on the natural environment and humans living in very, very close proximity with animals. And what we've got here is a young woman pictured here, again with that iconic image of the 2020 mask. At the centre of this Aussie icon, as I call them, the bad boys, fossil fuels, pitched to the community as our best bet for economic recovery. Could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I won't. I'll keep moving. When after week after week and month after month, fresh examples of this doom and gloom, such as this slide elicits, there's that hopelessness bubbles up. The drumbeat of news about climate change, ecological degradation can be deeply demoralising. So there's been a bit to be worried about this year, young, old and indifferent. And what it's spawning is this idea of ecological grief. Let's take a quick look at this so we can maybe understand it for ourselves, and then we can understand what ecological grief looks like when we do take on active coping. And my other computer has just dove right off the side of my desk in response to that. Am I all right, Sandy? Sandra? Yep, good. Okay, like I've said, 2020, particularly in response to the bushfires, we've had a lot in the media about these ideas: ecological grief, eco-anxiety, climate grief. I would say, not that I'm a psychologist, these are normal responses to a loss of connection to nature, or worry about the future or the natural environment. And what I've got on the slide for you here, as you take a look through, are some of the dimensions of what psychologists and researchers are starting to think about as something that's on the rise and will be potentially a major issue globally and into the future. So ecological grief can be expressed through mental and emotional reactions such as sadness, distress, despair, anger, fear, helplessness, depression, right over to the kind of where we get out to the illness end of mental health, and that's pre and post-traumatic stress. I would posit anyone motivated to join a seminar on nature and mental health and or run by Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre may have some lived experience of some of these fears or concerns about the natural environment, and it's relevant to you. It may resonate for you. So who is most affected by this thing called ecological grief? We know from the studies there's not many of them yet. It's an emerging area, and my research group's been doing a little bit of work on this. Early days though, it's a relatively new field. But ecological grief is more common among young people whose future depends on the environment, scientists, because day to day they've got their head in the game of studying the impacts of climate change and other environmental degradation issues on the natural environment. Those people who experience acute weather-related disasters, or I call it a climate-related event, are particularly switched on to ecological grief. And those people who live in a high climate risk area or are already at risk through living through health inequities and disparities, such as what we have in Australia. Some of the groups are listed on the slide here. And so that's ecological grief. Let's keep moving. So now let's look at the other part of the equation. We've heard about ecological grief. Let's turn our heads to hope, coping and wellness. For me, what is the antidote to ecological grief? I'm treading lightly again here because I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a researcher. And I've been dabbling with these ideas, and I'm just sharing some of this dabbling, but based in evidence and trying to find mental health promotion solutions. This idea of active coping is the active steps that we or you or other people you know take to reduce stresses, a stress's negative impact on mental health. Active coping is either by making needed changes in the environment, so external to you through problem or meaning focused coping, or adapting one's inner world or behavioural responses to the situation. And so on the purple ring of the slide that I'm presenting here, and I can imagine it might be a little bit small, so I do apologise for that, we've got all the active coping business, which is essentially the good stuff. That's where we want to be to protect and promote our mental health. So we've got a couple of things like seeking solutions, finding humour, that's one of my personal favourites, doing expressive writing. And then on the left-hand side, you've got things like, you know, the nourishing self, deep breathing, taking a walk, exercising, meditation, that sort of thing. Whereas the green ring demonstrates what's maladaptive or negative. It's a negative coping strategy. So that's things like denial, blaming, catastrophizing, and moving towards the middle, which is the blue, which is fear, rage, isolation, anxiety. And I'm not going to tick you on loss of control, click here, because we don't want to dive down there. But this is the framework in which we're starting to do our research, and psychologists are now working with this, what I would say, very real issue that is emerging, and particularly for young people in our communities as a result of the impacts of climate change and other concerns on the environment. All right, So I said that we've been doing a little bit of work with young people, 18 to 24. I'm going to zip through these slides because we have Sandy, and Sandy's the expert because she is a young person, to walk you through her testimony in a moment. But just some of the highlights from the research that we have to date. That on the slide is not my research, but it's the research of other scholars in this area. But what we do know, and it's a black cross against its name, is that young people are concerned, deeply concerned about climate change impacts on their future. That young people in Victoria, according to a Sustainability Victoria report, 15% of our young people in Victoria are not mentally coping with climate change. The flip side, the positive, is that we also know that youth with a strong sense of community and connection with natural environments have better resilience to the climate change impacts and concern. We also know that self-efficacy, resilience and agency, that sort of personal, I can lean into the world sense of self, increases in young people that are doing stuff on climate action. So I've just completed a project co-led with some wonderful young people from the Masters of Health and Human Services Management, and they're wonderful because they're also my students, on the impact of climate change on mental health for young people 18 to 24 years of age. They might be on the line if you are high game. We spoke to young people involved in climate organisations and then young people that aren't involved in climate organisations. We wanted to get a sense of how they're faring. So you can see by the positives, the plus sign and the kind of cross black sign is what was positive for their mental health and what was negative for their mental health. So being in nature, again, on stereo, is good for young people's mental health in this ecological grief space. When they have voice and they're listened to and they're not dismissed by the community, that boosts their mental health. Whereas government inaction or government denial or the fossil fuel piece, that's not great for mental health. And also this social media space, it's a double-edged sword because a lot of the apocalypse stuff comes from social media. So it is a little bit concerning. So our young people, they said they were worried about it. 89% surveyed said that they're familiar with eco-anxiety and they're not feeling particularly optimistic about the future. But again, here we go back to hope, coping and wellness. That taking action on climate change helps them to reduce the anxiety, increase the optimism and hope for the future. And down at the bottom is a nice quote from one of our climate heroes, we call them. And also one of our colleagues in our network, Erica Crawford, who's just finishing out her year 12, doing her thing on a climate strike. I think that looks like Geelong to me. Okay, so that's our young people. They're doing it hard on eco-anxiety, but amazingly, they're pushing through it with the acting coping piece and taking action on climate change. Now, I'm just going to skip through this one reasonably quickly because I don't want to, I want to get to Sandy very quickly. We're doing some work with environmental workers. So environmental workers are in nature, most of them, unless they're in management roles, are in nature day in, day out. They're our frontline workers. As a nurse and doctor is our frontline worker in a health service, an environmental worker is our frontline worker for protecting the health of nature. So there is some potential risk there for mental health issues. And we've done a small study, we're just starting this agenda, and we've found that workers in this sector are suffering from this idea of eco-anxiety, grief and loss because of bearing witness to climate change and environmental degradation. And because it's quite a complex workplace, it's under-resourced, there's a few challenges in that workplace. But for me, because they're frontline workers, and we need them to, we need to keep them buoyant and up and about and able to work. It's really important that we surface any mental health concerns for this sector and we find out ways to promote mental health of our environmental sector. And then again, we have contact with nature as an active coping. So part of what keeps them in this sector is the opportunities for contact with nature. They're so passionate about nature that helps them cope. Oops, my slides. Okay, this funky slide, let me just give it a rev up so we can get to the storyline quickly. Right. So is passion for nature linked to grief? Oops. So this diagram is suggesting, again, like the other ideas that I've talked about, it's a double-edged sword, yeah? You work in the environment, you get knowledgeable, yeah? You're super passionate about it, yeah? And then you have this sort of tension between the two. For example, the love of nature and passion equals hope, but then you also have to carry grief if you see environmental degradation. In the environmental sector, the urgency of the situation, driven by the element of hope and as well as despair, creates some overworking in this sector. They also have very strong shared values in this sector, but there's a culture of urgent and busy because of the scale of the environmental issues, leading to overwork. But again, I come back to that idea that a frontline worker in the environmental sector again cites the absolute power of connecting with nature for mental health promotion. This is my last fact slide because I've really hit you with the facts and I want to hand to Sandy very swiftly. But just a couple more highlights. These are 3 other areas of research which might help you to understand this connection between coping, mental health and nature. One of our team is an environmental psychologist. His name is Tristan Snell, and he looks at childhood contact with nature. And I imagine I've got a few parents on the line, so this might be interesting for you. And also because we've got adults on the line. So his contact with nature research looks at nature in childhood and what it does to adult personality. So he found high contact with nature in childhood predicts lower neuroticism, good news, and greater openness in adulthood. Also, contact with nature is that learned coping strategy, that active coping. So if you build an affiliation with nature and you can keep going back to it throughout your life course. So getting kids in nature early, often, and now is important. Also, play in nature, particularly forests, provides an ideal context for creative play, which may result in more creative adults. So if you are a forest kid, we imagine that you'll be a bit more creative than the non-forest kids. Now, the other thing is on this slide is nature-based activities. My research group has done a project called Feel Blue, Touch Green. And so they worked with people with existing mental illnesses. They put them in nature-based conservation activities willingly. That sounded as if it was involuntary. Absolutely willingly, down on the Surf Coast. And they found that as a result of participating in those nature-based conservation activities, improved mental health, improved physical health, and improved general well-being. Final one, green prescriptions, which is a really neat idea. I don't know if we've got any medicos on the line, but one of my students from the Masters of Public Health, she's a GP from the Philippines. She's come to Australia. She's doing her degree with us. We're very fortunate to have her. She is a GP, and she said she is seeing people in their 20s coming to her with chronic diseases, obesity, those sorts of things, and also mental health issues. As a GP, she doesn't want to set people up immediately on medical plans. So she got really interested in this idea of green prescriptions, which is essentially a GP, instead of writing out a take a pill script, it's take a green script, which invites the person to go out into nature, take some exercise as a way to promote your mental health and also as a way to promote your physical health. And what my colleague, my GP student found is that the GP script both helps with the prevention and treatment of non-communicable diseases and helps with the prevention and management of mental health issues. So, if you're not convinced yet about the benefits of contact with nature, I'm going to send you off in about half an hour to go and get some and do a lived experiment for yourself.
Very much, Rebecca, for that first part, because we are going to come back to Rebecca shortly, but we're now going to switch to Sandy Gonzalez, still a Vega. And Sandy is an environmental science graduate at Deakin University, and that's a proud partner of the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre. She's a former volunteer of the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre, but we still claim her. We're not letting her go that easily. Through her studies, she's developed a paper exploring climate grief and ways of coping, prompted by the last summer bushfires. The paper was targeted for the community, particularly young people and climate activists who face greater impacts of climate grief. Sandy has a passion for volunteering, community involvement and participating in innovative projects to take action on climate change. And now we'll hear from Sandy. Fire away.
Great, thanks Sandra and thanks Rebecca. And I'd just like to thank the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre for inviting me to participate in this talk. You know, I'm so happy that this is a topic that's getting more attention as it deserves. And as Sandra mentioned, part of the talk I will be majorly talking about a paper I prepared on climate grief. And I just thought I should give a bit of background as to why I wrote the paper, because it does have some relevance. So through my studies, I had to do an internship, and I chose to partner with the Hobsons Bay City Council. And the project that I worked on was kickstarting the social media side of things and the event coordination. So with the Hobsons Bay Sustainability Collective, part of the project that I was working on was kickstarting the social media and event coordination for the new environmental community group in Hobsons Bay. So the Hobsons Bay Sustainability Collective. And essentially that's a group that tries to integrate already existing environmental community groups in Hobsons Bay. But at the same time, it's a group that is really trying to create a space for people in the community groups to give them a space where they can be social, you know, they can meet like-minded people, they can share experiences, as well as taking climate action. And during my internship, my supervisor, Jen McQueenie, and I, we really noticed that people in the groups, the community groups for the environment, were really experiencing climate grief. And something that we thought that we could do, something that I could do, was to create this briefing paper as a sort of way to bring the topic onto the table and to make it a resource for people that they could really use to understand maybe their experiences a little bit better. So before I carry on, some of you may feel like my content will be heavy, and I would like to be cautious about that. But I promise that it does wrap around in a positive light, so please bear with me. And if you do need to access the resources that we have up on the chat, please do so. So, and one of the best coping mechanisms that I've identified in my paper is being able to be honest and openly vulnerable with these feelings, you know, and talking really does help. So in my paper, I cover a brief what is climate grief, and Rebecca's already touched on it, and I'll just briefly go over it very quickly. So climate grief is conceptualizing the environmental losses that have occurred and the future losses that are to come. You know, and climate grief has some similarities with the experience of losing a loved one, for example. You know, usually the death of a loved one is experienced. So usually the grief that you experience after losing a loved one is experienced after they have gone. So that's when the grieving comes. It's after they've gone. And that is a linear and singular experience. So whilst climate grief has similarities with this type of grief, you know, both are really different in a way, because climate grief is quite unique in that the grief is experienced continuously. And like Rebecca mentioned, climate grief is really experienced in the majority way by people working in the environment, people that are volunteering, people who are climate activists, and of course people who Indigenous peoples who their whole culture is in the environment. And within these, young people are amongst the most severely affected because, and I think this is very much of my own experience, but the reason I think this is so, because me as a young person, it's really hard to imagine 50 to 60 years in time. It for me is just too far away. Like I really am just getting day to day, basing my consciousness around what I'm doing, and I think that's what a lot of young people do as well. But at the same time, we have, young people are very scientifically literate, especially around the environmental and climate sector, because we have all this data, and we know, we know what the climate is going to look like, and as we've experienced earlier this year with the bushfires, it's hard. It's like we have a skewed perception of our futures as young people. And this can lead to, feeling helpless, and it can have dissociative effects, where people are disengaged with current affairs, and this is possibly at a time when it's the most important to know who our leaders are. So my personal anecdote during the bushfires, I remember one day earlier this year, I was doing uni work, and I really struggled in one particular day because I looked out the window, and all I could see was smoke, and it really did feel like rather apocalyptic. And for me, I have a partner, and I'm someone that definitely wants to have kids, but in that state of mind, it really made me question whether I actually wanted to bring kids into this world. And that's really heavy. But, it is what I was experiencing. And, I'm someone that's really happy to be open about this. But of course, you will have people that have very different boundaries of what they are prepared to share. And that's totally fine. That's I think, being accepting of this and being gentle with each other is definitely something important. But now that brings me to coping mechanisms that, I identified in my paper, but also that I personally identify with. So having the ability to foster a community feeling and having shared vulnerability in the space is a huge benefit, because it really normalizes the experience. It's for me, and, in my paper, I talk about how it's really important to make note that this is entirely normal to experience. Not that climate change is normal, but your own experience are very valid. And it's also important to have access to a group where climate grief can be discussed and the experiences can be shared. So this is what the Hobsons Bay Sustainability Collective is very much trying to do, and also what the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre is doing. And what can happen as a result of this is people banding together and being inspired to take environmental action in whatever capacity. And in my own account, I love volunteering. This is exactly the reason why I love volunteering. I volunteered with the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre for a year and a half. And I feel like it's something that I really need to do to keep me going, to keep me motivated. Other people totally inspire me, especially around the environment. And just a quote from the American Psychological Foundation: climate grief can be managed by feeling, talking, uniting, and acting. And then my all-time, personal way of combating my own climate grief is spending time in nature. It's really going out into nature and noticing what makes us feel grateful for its existence, and being able to appreciate and celebrate nature is going to be extremely soothing to you. And I love doing this. I go out into nature, into day hikes by myself, but I take people with me. And I think it's actually a form of activism. If we had more people spending their days out in nature with their friends, I think it really builds a culture of what we value as a society. And just to conclude, I'd just like to share the conclusion from my paper that I wrote. So I say, climate grief is the unveiling of the deep connection between nature and humans that was there all along. It is a reminder that we are very much a part of nature, no matter where we live. And that when our ecosystems heal, we will heal alongside them. And it's an opportunity to channel our grief and allow it to empower and unite us so we may work towards solutions. Thank you, and now over to Rebecca.
Beautiful and uplifting, Sandy, and segue back to Rebecca. But before we do that, can I just do a time check, Rebecca,
Yeah.
because we are pushing close to 3 o'clock. You have some more slides and the opportunity for Q&A, and we may have people who have to leave.
That's right. I've just got a handful of fun bits and pieces, and then yeah. How am I going? My slide up? All good? So that was over to Sandy, then we're back to me. Thank you so much, Sandy, for being generous about your own lived experience. It's very powerful testimony, and again, just to say that our future is in good hands with people like Sandy thinking about this deeply, and will be, leading our organisations in years to come. So this little bit to leave us on is about coping and wellness again, and trying to package up a handful, just a small handful of what you can do for yourself or your family or your local community in terms of strategies for promoting mental health through connections with nature. And at the end, I'll tell you whose nature joys are what. So what can we do in the community, in the local community? Well, first of all, you can contribute to science. I've currently got a national survey running. You might see it in the ABC's media next week, called the Climate Change and Mental Health Australian Temperature Check. Take that survey, it's 10 minutes, and it helps generate the science, the much needed science. The second point is participating in citizen science. The Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre is going to have, and already has, a strong theme about citizen science. It's a kind of help generate the science, but also be in nature. So there's a link at the bottom and we can share that. Then for personal wellness of yourself and your family, there's a wonderful organisation. It's the partner of the Climate and Health Alliance, which I'm the Vice President of, very proudly. And it's called the Psychologist for a Safe Climate. And they offer a 10-day creative nature-based care program. So you sign up for $40 donation, and they will walk you through a program for 10 days of nature-based healing, wellness, and connection. I've done it, so I can testify to its beauty. There's also a virtual nature festival that's happening online, and there's the link. And then there's one at the bottom. I was going to get rid of it because it's an app-based, and after watching